Hi, I'm Marc Miklich, Technical Product Manager for Small Character Technologies here at Squid Ink. On today's JetStream related video, we're going to discuss troubleshooting the vacuum circuit of the system. All right, when we're talking about the vacuum circuit or the suction part of the system, there's a couple different things we can be talking about. One is the gutter or vacuum in the printhead or ink return in the printhead that reclaims any ink that we don't print with. So that's one part of this hydraulic circuit. The other is the bleed circuit for the printhead as well. So for bleed purposes or back flushing purposes in this hydraulic circuit. So we're going to look at hardware specific to that part of the system. First, we're going to focus specifically on the gutter, okay, or the ink return of the system in the printhead primarily. So we're going to discuss a couple symptoms that might tell us that we have a problem with this part of the printer. So we'll look at the printhead here and have some audio and visual cues as to what might be happening that would have us troubleshoot this part of the system. Again, we're talking about the gutter in this instance, or that's what we're focusing on. So again, when we're talking about the gutter or the ink return of the printer, we're talking about basically this little tube right here. So any ink that we don't print with is going to go into this tube and be reclaimed by the system. So we have to have suction or a vacuum here to pull that fluid back through. Okay, so in order for us to identify potential symptoms or issues here, first of all, we need to be jetting. Okay, so our printer is actively running and jetting so we can see or hear what's going on in the printhead. Okay, normally if everything's okay, you're going to notice a nice consistent suction sound here in all of our ink that we're not using to print with. In this scenario, we're not printing at all since the printhead is out of the sleeve, but all of our ink is returning into this tube, nothing spilling out. We've got a nice consistent vacuum or suction sound here. Okay, so one symptom of a weak vacuum or vacuum issues with the system would be, instead of a nice consistent vacuum or suction sound here, you'd hear intermittent suction. So we'll hear a nice suction noise followed by basically nothing, just dead silence. If we hear the vacuum or the suction cutting in and out, again, that's a good indicator that we do have some sort of issue with the vacuum circuit of our printer. Another symptom, would be a very noticeable symptom, would be if ink is just pouring out of the gutter. Basically what would be happening in that scenario is our jet is going into the gutter, but it's not being reclaimed or not being pulled into the system. Okay, so in that scenario you would have no vacuum whatsoever. Ink would just be spilling back out of the gutter. One very important distinction to make there is that the jet is going into the gutter. If the jet's not going into the gutter and we have ink everywhere, that's a totally different issue, and I would recommend you watch our printhead or ink alignment troubleshooting videos. So again, very important to make sure the jet is going into the gutter in this scenario. If ink is just pouring back out, again, that's a good indication we have a vacuum problem. All right, if we notice that there is debris in our gutter filter, external debris, so maybe it's dust or something of that nature, if you're working in a really dirty, dusty environment and we see that our filter is compromised with something organic outside of ink, okay, so again, dust or something from the environment, couple things we want to be mindful of. One is, keep in mind we do have a vacuum in the printhead, okay, so the gutter or vacuum tube or ink return tube is constantly sucking in, so we're generating a vacuum inside the head. So if you're in a really bad environment, we could be pulling in debris from your environment into the gutter line and into that gutter filter. If that's happening in your scenario, please refer to our installing positive air kit for the printhead or a printhead pressurization kit. If we install one of those, it will keep a positive airflow out of the printhead so no dust or debris can be pulled in. Okay, if we've identified that we do have a vacuum issue with the system or a suction issue with the system, again, the print head's going to tell you a lot in this scenario if the printer is jetting. Again, if you have inconsistent suction at the print head or none at all, those are really good indicators there's a vacuum problem. So in that scenario, what we would do is we would stop jetting first. So we're going to shut the system down. We're just going to click stop jetting, and I'm going to stop jetting with cleaning. Okay, so our system is no longer jetting. That's going to allow us to do some troubleshooting on the hydraulic side of the system here related to the vacuum circuit. The first thing we're going to look at, or the easiest thing to look at first, is the gutter valve. So we do have a valve that controls where the vacuum is being directed in the system. It's a bidirectional valve, so there's only two different areas we apply vacuum. One is the gutter circuit, which we're focusing on right now. The other is the bleed or backflush circuit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into system diagnostic, and we're going to toggle that gutter valve, which is valve 5 or YV5. We're going to make sure that the valve is actually functioning. This is the easiest thing to check first. Okay, so to troubleshoot valve 5, or to begin troubleshooting valve 5, we're going to go to settings. We're going to go to diagnostic and then device. And just remember, this password is always the current day's date. It's 2-digit day, 2-digit month, 2-digit year format. So today, it's February 26th, 2021. We're going to go 260221. Okay, so that gives us access to our device diagnostic here on the right-hand side. And again, all we're looking for is valve 5 at this point. You may have seen some of our previous videos using this feature for troubleshooting, specifically with valves. If you toggle the on-off for the valve, we should hear a nice audible clicking. Unless you're in a really, really loud environment, you should be able to hear this. So if we click on-off here with valve 5, we should hear it firing if it is functioning. And even though you'll see there's a debugging pop-up here, you can continue to open and close the valve. And hopefully you guys can hear that clicking in the background. Okay, if you don't hear any clicking whatsoever, that's a pretty good indication that the plunger inside the valve is stuck and we're not able to utilize the valve to direct the vacuum in the system. All right, if valve 5 doesn't appear to be functioning, again, that's our gutter valve. We're going to go to the back of the machine. We're going to take the valve out, disassemble it, and make sure that it's not stuck. Again, so we're going to make sure the plunger is able to move freely so we can direct the vacuum flow. We're going to power the printer off in this scenario. Since we will be removing a valve from the system, we'll make sure that the system is powered down. Okay, so again, we're looking for valve 5. This one's pretty easy to find. Again, they all are labeled for you guys. So valve 5 is the leftmost valve in the system here. So valve 5, that's what we want to troubleshoot. We want to take this apart, clean it up, make sure it's functioning properly. Another thing we can do as well is make sure we do have 24 volts to the valve. So when we take the leads or the wires off, if you guys do have a multimeter, we could power the machine back on. You could use system diagnostic again to toggle the valve. You could just make sure that we are getting 24 volts here. But outside of that, we're going to take this out. Again, we're going to clean it up, disassemble it, clean it, make sure that that plunger is moving freely. Okay, so we're just going to back these two screws out. Before we completely pull the valve off the manifold, you may have seen this in our other videos as well. There might be a little bit of residual fluid here, so it's never a bad idea to just get a lint-free cloth and kind of wedge it underneath the valve here, so if we do get some ink, we don't make a big mess. Okay, so the valve is already unbolted from the manifold. Gives us a little bit easier access to it. We're going to pull our wires off. And you can pull these off before too. Okay, if we need to get a little bit easier access to this, to pull the top tube off, again, remember that the drawer will slide out. There's just a couple screws that are holding it in front. Okay, so now what we need to do is, again, just pop this hydraulic line off. A pair of side cutters or pliers are helpful in this scenario to get both this little compression or this little fitting up, and then the tube itself we need to get off as well. So we're going to try to just pry that up, and if you do a little damage to the tube, that's okay. We can always trim it, clean it up a little bit. So we've got the valve out of the system. One thing to be mindful of, again, with these valves, there are a pair of O-rings that are normally on this side. Okay, so what you'll actually see with this valve is they both stuck to the manifold. And that's not a bad thing, but just be mindful that we do need these when we reinstall the valve, okay? So we'll grab those and set them aside. Now what we want to do is actually take the solenoid off of the valve so we can access the plunger assembly, make sure that that's not stuck. Realistically, that would be the most likely cause if this valve were not working, that plunger being stuck. So with this valve, what we need to do, we've got this little locking clip up top here, so we need to slide this off, and that will allow us to slide the plunger assembly out of the solenoid, okay? It does help to have something like a set of needle nose in this scenario, and we can just kind of pop this clip off. So again, this is our locking clip up here. So when you're sliding this clip off, this is what you should see. And again, when you get it far enough, it should just kind of pop off. Hopefully not fall off like that. So it'll pop off, and then there is a flat washer underneath, so just be mindful of that. And what we can do at this point with the clip off is we can actually slide the plunger housing out of the solenoid, okay? So this is what we want to get at. This is where the moving parts are, and this is what could potentially be seized up. So again, we're going to set the solenoid off to the side. Be aware again of this flat washer. Make sure you don't lose that. Okay, so in order to take this apart to access the plunger, we do have 4 more screws to deal with. These do require a torque driver. This is a T10. So we're going to back these out, and this will allow us to pull the cap off and again access that plunger assembly that's inside this shaft here. Okay, so we've got our 4 screws out. And you'll notice there's a little bit of ink in here. Again, a little bit of a mess, not too bad. But what we're really trying to get at is this plunger right here. You'll see that's spring loaded. This is what's opening and closing when we energize or de-energize that solenoid. If the valve wasn't functioning, this is typically stuck. And it's usually stuck in like this. So if this is moving freely, that's a great sign. If it's not, what we need to do is clean this up, and you can actually take this plunger out. And again, you'll see there's a little bit of ink inside here. But what we would want to do in the scenario in which this was stuck or the spring is stuck is we just need to clean all this up. If there's dried up ink, we just need to get that removed, make sure everything's nice and clean. We'll put it back together and we should be good to go. One thing I'll point out too is this plunger housing, there is a large O-ring here. Now it does a pretty good job of staying seated, but make sure that that is there when you're done cleaning up and we put this assembly back together. Okay, so once you've got this cleaned up, again, that spring should be moving freely, that plunger should be moving freely. That's what we want to see, okay? So now we're going to reassemble the entire valve or plunger assembly. We'll slide this back into the solenoid, and then we will reconnect our hydraulic line and wires, and we'll put this back on the manifold. Okay, so now we're going to slide the solenoid back onto our valve here. Again, make sure our flat washer is here. We're going to put the clip back on, and then again, be mindful of your O-rings. So we will have to put the 2 O-rings back here before we bolt this onto the manifold. I personally like to reinstall the valve onto the manifold. Then we can connect our hydraulic line and our wires here. So we've got our O-rings, or we've got our assembly clip back together. We've got our O-rings installed, and we've got our screws in. So we're ready to mount this to the manifold. This is how it should look. So we're going to reinstall the hydraulic line here first, making that little fitting over the top. We're going to go ahead and get this bolted up to the manifold. Again, make sure those O-rings are reinstalled. And you'll see we've cleaned off the manifold a little bit, so we have a nice clean area that we're bolting this up against. Okay, we're going to hook our wires back up. Again, you'll notice we have kind of a color scheme going here. So red is always on the left. And the opposite color is always on the right. And these are just solenoids, so it actually doesn't matter if by chance you get your polarity swapped here, they will still function. But if you want everything to match up, just follow the sequence here. So we've got our valve cleaned out and reinstalled. We'll test it really quick one last time just to verify that that was or was not the problem. All right, so we verified that valve 5 was or was not the issue. Okay, so we've already gone through the troubleshooting process for our gutter valve, if you will. The next thing we're going to look at is the gutter filter. Okay, so we do have an inline filter for the vacuum circuit or the gutter circuit. So we'll take a look at that. It's really easy to identify for a couple reasons. One is if we come in the back of the printer here, the gutter filter is on the red stripe hydraulic line. So you'll see there's a red stripe on the tubing. And it's also a different micron size than our other 2 inline filters. It's a little tough to see, but it is etched into the body of the filter. So this is a 50 micron inline filter. Our other 2 inline filters are 10 micron. Okay, so this is another way to identify your gutter filter. What we can do with this is, again, if we're having vacuum issues, we'll make sure that this isn't plugged. If it needs to be cleaned, we can also replace this very easily. This is also an inexpensive part but important part of this system. So we'll take a look at this next. So we can take these filters out and apart fairly easily. One thing you're going to want to do, again, is get a lint-free cloth underneath the filter in case there is any residual ink or fluid in here. When we take these compression fittings off, there's a chance we will have a little bit of a mess. One thing you do want to pay attention to here is the directional flow in this part of the circuit. So there is an arrow, a flow indicator on the filter. We want to keep track of which side is which on this filter when we connect everything back up. We don't want to install this backwards, so be mindful of that. If you need to, put an indicator on either your input or output side so you know what goes where. To remove the filter, again, we've got 2 compression fittings. These are usually just hand tight, so we can just back these off. Okay, and here's our filter. Okay, so we've got our filter removed, and what we're actually going to do is basically back flush the filter first. If we think there's a really significant obstruction in here or blockage that's causing us to have no ink at the head, we don't want to force any more fluid on the input side. We're just likely going to be pushing that obstruction in even more. So we're going to back flush, okay, against that directional flow and see if we can get fluid to pass through the filter. Okay, so we've got our squeeze bottle, again with makeup in it. Again, make sure that this makeup or cleaner matches the makeup that your system is using. So all we're gonna do, again, we're gonna put this in the output side, and we're just gonna force some fluid through it. Now this particular filter, we've got a real good flow through. This would be a good sign that we've got the obstruction out. Okay, if you're not able to do this, if you can't get any fluid through, that means that this thing is basically completely plugged. If that's the case, there's 2 things we can do. One, we can disassemble the filter from here, try to clean it out some more, or just replace it. These are very inexpensive inline filters and obviously very important for the system to function properly. So those are the two steps we would take from here. Okay, to disassemble the filter, you'll notice the output side is actually kind of notched out so we can fit a wrench on it. So you can actually unthread this end of the filter to get at the filtering element. Okay, so here's the actual filtering element right here. It's kind of got that metallic mesh screen appearance to it. And you might even be able to see on the video there is some debris on the filter. Not a lot, it wouldn't be enough to completely plug this, but there is some debris on this side. We can check the whole thing. Not too bad, but again, if this were blocked, we would see a lot of debris here, especially on this outer side. If you see that again, you can try to clean it off as best you can. If it's really built up, I would highly recommend just swapping out the entire filter. Again, very inexpensive component. All right, so we're just washing this off, getting the little bit of debris that was on here out, and we're going to go ahead and reassemble the filter. One thing to be mindful of is there is obviously an O-ring here. This is beneath the threads on this connector, so it's highly unlikely that this O-ring is going to come off, but just make sure that it is there. So we're going to pop the filter back together here, and then we'll screw it back together. Okay, and then just make sure again when you reinstall this, you've got the directional flow going in the right direction. It is always a good idea once you've got a filter reinstalled, just give a little tug on the tubes on each side and make sure that they don't slide out freely. That would obviously create a mess when we fire the system back up. So again, as far as disassembling, cleaning the valve, pretty straightforward. And again, I know I've already mentioned this a couple times, but if it does appear dirty and you just can't clean it up, just replace it. Again, inexpensive, easy to replace. So we've talked about the gutter valve and also the gutter filters, possible failure points for the gutter circuit. So again, if we have vacuum issues for our gutter, we've talked about those two pieces of the puzzle. The last major component to this circuit is the Venturi. This is what's actually generating the vacuum for the system, both for the gutter and for the bleed or backflush line. Okay, so we don't have a dedicated pump or vacuum pump for the system. We use the Venturi along with our main pressure pump to generate vacuum. So how this works is we force fluid into the Venturi from our main pressure pump. That fluid is basically kind of funneled down. When we do that with the fluid, when we kind of funnel it down, the velocity of the fluid increases, and inside this assembly, where that velocity of the fluid increases, we actually start to generate a negative pressure or a vacuum. What we do with that is we've got this little tube tapped into the side of the Venturi. This is our actual vacuum line for the entire system right here. So both for the gutter and for the bleed line. This is our vacuum tube. Okay, so we've got fluid being forced into the assembly, generating a vacuum. It applies a vacuum to this tube. Both the fluid we're forcing in and the fluid we're pulling through that vacuum line all end up in this large diameter tube that goes into the system. And all of this fluid in this line goes directly back into the mix tank. Okay, so we're forcing fluid in, the fluid we're pulling in from the vacuum, all of that goes back into the mix tank. So that's where this tube is heading. Okay, so again, if we have intermittent vacuum in the system, we've talked about the symptoms at the print head. If the suction is intermittent, it cuts in and out, or potentially there's no vacuum whatsoever, this could very well be the culprit. There's a couple things we can do here. We can take it out and try to clean it, or we can just replace it. This is also a very inexpensive component, but it's obviously very, very critical, a very important part of the system for everything to work properly. So if we can't get it clean, we'll just swap it out. So we'll show you how to do both. All right, we're going to look at removing the Venturi. So we'll show you how to get it out of the system. One thing to be prepared for when you work on the Venturi is there can be a considerable amount of ink in this part of the system. So we're definitely going to want lint-free rags underneath this assembly when we start working on it. First thing we're going to do is just get it removed so we can clean it, and if we can't get it clean, then we're ready to replace it as well. So we're going to slide the hydraulic compartment out a little bit, give us a little easier access to the Venturi. So all we're trying to get at is this assembly right here. So you'll see we've got two large diameter tubes, we've got an input, an output, and then our vacuum line. We're basically just going to disconnect our tubes so we can try to clean out this part of the assembly. Okay, this is another item where we do want to make sure we keep track of directional flow. It's pretty easy with the Venturi. If you're not certain, there is actually an arrow etched into the body of the Venturi. This is showing where the fluid is being forced in. Okay, so this is the input, and the other side is the output. And again, this is our vacuum line here. So again, it's pretty easy to keep track of what tube goes where. The tube coming from the bottom of the manifold is the input. The tube that goes up and out to the mix tank is the output. But just make sure you keep track of that. Okay, so we're going to disconnect both of these Festo compression fittings here. These are also just hand tight. And again, be prepared for some ink or fluid to be coming out of this assembly. So once we get this fitting off, we just have to pop the tubing off of this Festo connector. Okay, and again, you'll see there's going to be a bit of ink inside this assembly, so be prepared. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so we've got the output side disconnected. Now we're going to disconnect the input side. Same thing, we're just going to pop the tubing off. Okay, and you can kind of see the volume of excess ink that you can expect. It's not terrible, but if you're not ready, it will make a little bit of a mess. All right, lastly, we're just going to get the vacuum line disconnected here. Again, a small pair of side cutters is useful with this. So we just kind of get it around the base and pry it up. And again, if you do a little teeny bit of damage to the tubing, we can always trim it and clean it up. Okay, so we've got our Venturi completely removed from the printer. Okay, so what we're going to do now is try to clean this out. Basically, we're going to back flush it. So again, this is our input side here. You know, we've got that directional arrow as our indicator. If the Venturi is the problem with our vacuum or suction in the system, it's oftentimes likely because we have an obstruction that was forced into the input side, so into this side. So what we don't want to do is force more fluid into this side of the assembly. We want to back flush it out. So we can do that in a couple different ways. We can plug off either our vacuum line or our output side and force fluid through either one we leave open. So what I'm going to do first is just plug the vacuum side. We're going to force some cleaner into the output, and hopefully we can get it to come out of the input. That will effectively back flush the assembly. Okay, so you can see I've got a real easy, consistent flow coming out. We've worked all the ink out. If you see something like this, that's a pretty good indication that it's clear and clean. If you're getting a really weak flow out or nothing's coming out whatsoever, that means you've got a fairly significant obstruction inside your Venturi. If you can't get it cleaned out, again, just swap this out. Really inexpensive component. We can also block off the output side and try to force a little bit of fluid on the vacuum side, make sure that's clear. You're not going to have as aggressive of a flow, mainly because our squeeze bottle nozzle here doesn't quite fit into that barb vacuum fitting as well. But we should be able to see fluid coming out of this side too. Okay, and again, one last time, if you cannot back flush this, if fluid is really struggling to come out of the input side, just replace this component. Again, it's very critical that this is clear for the machine to function properly, especially on the vacuum side. Very, very inexpensive but important piece of the printer. So if you're having troubles, replace it. Okay, so we're going to reinstall either our cleaned out Venturi or we're just installing a new one here. Again, just be mindful of the input side here. This lower large diameter tube coming out of the bottom of the manifold has to go here. So we're going to slide the input tube back on. So make sure that's nice and secure on the fitting here. And we'll just reinstall the compression fitting. Again, these are just hand tight. All right. Now we'll put the vacuum line back on. And again, if you did, when you remove this, if you did a little bit of damage to it, just trim it up a little bit, clean it up, then it'll slide right back on this barb fitting here. And then we've got our output side. Pop that on. Put the compression fitting back on. And that's it. We'll clean that up a little bit, but simple as that. All right, so we've looked at the primary hardware components in our vacuum circuit and mostly specifically to the gutter or ink return part of the system. Now, one thing we mentioned at the beginning of the video is our gutter valve, or valve 5, is bidirectional. So depending on how we have that positioned, we can either apply the vacuum to the gutter or the ink return, which is where it is most of the time, or we can position it so it's applying the vacuum to the bleed or backflush circuit in the print head. There's really only one other piece of hardware involved with that part of the circuit, that part of the vacuum circuit, and that's the bleed valve in the print head. That will be covered in our print head troubleshooting videos. All right, so once we've finished looking at those critical hardware components for the vacuum circuit of our JetStream, we're just gonna go ahead and fire the printer back up and make sure that we've got a good consistent suction at our gutter. So again, the major components we look at here, valve 5, the inline filter for the gutter, and also the Venturi. Those are really the three big things to take a look at here. So that wraps up our video for troubleshooting the vacuum circuit of our JetStream CIJ printer. If you want to see more videos on this product, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got videos on the JetStream and a lot of our other products, or don't hesitate to head to squidink.com for additional information on our product line. Thanks again.